Okay, today we're going to. This is the last lecture. This is the last lecture. That's the not the first. That's the end of it. Okay, this is the last lecture. It's going to be a little bit long because these chapters are a little bit long, but this is it. This is the last one. Everything needs to be in by Friday the 31st. I have to turn in grades on the second, wait a minute, first, second, third. I have to turn in grades on the 3rd of August. So there you go. You got to have everything done by Friday so that I can get my grades in. Okay. So what we're talking about now is secondary data and content analysis, chapter 13. There are three primary benefits to using secondary data. Conceptual-substantive benefits. Secondary data are sometimes the only data available for the study of certain research problems. Social and political historians, for example, must rely almost exclusively on secondary data, given the nature of their research. So somebody like Marius, who is a historian, he has no choice. He didn't live through all of history, so a lot of things that he has to research, he can only get from secondary sources. Secondary data can also be used for purposes of comparison. Comparisons within and between nations or social groups may expand the scope of generalizations and provide additional insights into events and processes. In some cases, attempting to collect primary data can be dangerous or unethical, and this is one of the things that you need to be aware of. That a good example would be how the federal government stole the DNA of select native tribes. They were doing something else, and they actually were using it to do DNA studies, which was unethical because they didn't tell them they were going to do it. Methodological benefits. First, secondary data, if reliable and accurate, provide opportunities for replication. Second, the availability of data collected at different points in time enables the researcher to employ longitudinal research designs. Third, secondary analysis may improve the validity of measurement by expanding the scope of the independent variables employed when operationalizing major concepts. Fourth, by using secondary data, we can increase the sample size, its representativeness, and the number of observations, factors that contribute to more encompassing generalizations. Finally, secondary data can be used for triangulation, the use of different kinds of data to test the same hypothesis, thereby increasing the validity of the finding obtained from primary data. The cost, primary research is a costly undertaking. Conducting a nationally representative survey is sometimes prohibitively expensive for university professors, independent researchers, and graduate students, especially in light of increasing cutbacks in research support and funding opportunities, which may mean that in the future, because of all the cutbacks that we've had, and I'm sure after COVID-19, there's not going to be a whole lot of money out there for research in anything except medicine, trying to head off the next big medical crisis. There's not going to be very much money out there for anybody. So PhDs may be a bit of an oddity in the future, since it's going to be so difficult to get your research done. It is infinitely less expensive to use existing data than to collect new primary data. Methodological advantages provide opportunities for replication. It allows for longitudinal research designs. It may improve the validity of measurement. It can increase the sample size, its representativeness, and the number of observations. It can be used for triangulation. Limitations often only approximate the kinds of data that the investigator would like to employ for testing hypotheses. limited access to data sets, which often must be bought to gain access, insufficient knowledge of how the secondary data was collected in order to find potential sources of bias, errors, or problems with internal and external validity. The picture to the right is really kind of interesting. That's the very first computer. And as you can see, the women are in shirt sleeves. This is during World War II, and it generated a great deal of heat. Of course, it's nothing compared to what you have in your computer today. And it was as big as a room. It was literally that large. And they had to cool it on a continual basis. Guidelines to locating useful data. Number one, specify your needs. Clearly identify and define the theories and concepts of interest, desired operationalizations and measures, and potential sources of bias. Know the material. Identify and use keywords and phrases to search library catalogs and holdings, data archives, and the internet more generally to familiarize yourself with the types of secondary data available. And this is really important. If you want to do research on anything, and of course you're going to be doing research probably, unless you do field work at the end of your program, you're either going to be reading extensively in a select area, or you're going to be doing your own research. You're either going to take 497, 498, or 499. 497, of course, is advanced reading in psychology, and that is the class that I'm teaching right now. I may not be teaching it when you're finished, but right now, what you have to do is write a thesis, and you have to do extensive research in a select area. A lot of individuals are choosing topics that deal with the Navajo Nation. Kind of tough because there's not a whole lot of information out there dealing with the Navajo Nation. Not a lot of research has been done in the past. There's not a lot going on right now. And of course, with COVID-19, there's not going to be a lot that happens in the near future. I wouldn't imagine. There won't be money for it. Sometimes it might be easier to select a more general field or something that deals with that you know that there's information out there. Where am I talking? Okay, number three, secure the data. Get in touch with local experts who are familiar with each secondary data source. Use these contacts to field and answer questions to obtain any relevant permissions for securing the data and to develop new contacts. The reality is that librarians, you've watched librarians probably all your life. You can imagine that they don't have a whole lot to do, so they like it when people ask them questions. They live for this stuff, as weird as that sounds. Number four, begin the analyses, pore over the data, view, clean, and conduct several initial inquiries to get your feet wet in using these data. Repeat this process until you are familiar with the data and ready to conduct your analysis. Secondary data contains what are referred to as unobtrusive measures, also known as nonreactive measures. The researcher has no influence on the conditions under which the data were collected. Two broad classes of unobtrusive measures: erosion measures, signs left after use of an object, for example, the wear on a library book, is a marker of its popularity. And accretion measures capture the buildup versus erosion of human activity. In this case, the researchers examine remnants that are suggestive of potential behaviors. An example would be looking at the checkout card for a library book. In the old days, now they scan them, but once upon a time, there was an envelope in the back of the library book, and they would put a library card in there. And if you checked it out, then you'd have to write your name on it. So, of course, you'd have all these names on the library card telling you who had checked out the library card in the near future or in the past or whatever. And sometimes they'd leave old library cards in there so that you could see if your dad read it 15 or 20 years ago or whatever. Really kind of fascinating. Of course, they don't do that anymore. Probably all those cards are gone and stored someplace. But that's an accretion measure. Four basic types of simple observation: physical signs. Researchers might observe the exterior body of its physical aspects as if they were indicators or signs of behavior patterns and attitudes. Examples of such measures are tattoos, hairstyles, clothing, ornamental items such as jewelry and other objects. I'm 71 years old, and I can see somebody's clothes, and I can say, we wore that stuff back in the, those are bell bottoms. We used to wear those in the late 60s. Or look how long his hair is. That he must be in the 70s. The Beatles started longer hairstyles in 1963, 1964. And the hairstyles slowly got longer and longer and longer until the 1970s, and then men started growing their hair extremely long. So you can look at these kinds of things. You can look at a woman's hemline to tell if she were, or whether she was wearing gloves. When my mother was raising her children in the 1950s, she would always have to wear gloves if she went someplace. That was a polite thing to do. And if you didn't wear gloves, it meant that you were either of a select social class, a lower social class, or it meant that you didn't consider where you were going important enough to wear gloves. Everybody wore gloves. Everybody wore skirts. I can remember my mother stopped going to church because one time she went to church. She'd been working out in the yard, and she'd forgotten about a meeting at the church, and she was wearing a pair of shorts, and she ran inside. And of course, she threw us all in the car, and we drove over there. And she went in, and the minister wouldn't let her into the meeting because she wasn't dressed properly, and she ripped him up one side and down the other. I'll tell you what, my mother's she swears really good. If she did, she's not alive anymore, but she really gave him a hard time over his decision not to let her in the meeting. And of course, that was the last time we ever came anywhere close to a church. It was when the minister removed my mother. Of course, he was all kinds of flavors of son of a bitch. I'll tell you, it was really kind of interesting. Anyway, you can. So there are physical signs. Once upon a time, the only people with tattoos were people who had been in the military, and specifically people who had been in the Navy. The Army guys didn't really tattoo themselves. Marines did sometimes, but the Army, the Air Force, those guys never tattooed themselves. Now everybody just paints themselves like crazy. Everybody's inked up. But back in the 60s, it was rare to see somebody with a tattoo, and never females. And now, of course, women are getting all kinds of tattoos. We'll see what happens in the future, Expressions, simple analysis of expressive movement requires researchers to focus on the self-expressive features of the body and how these movements indicate social interactions. People communicate feelings and social norms through body language, and of course those have changed over time as well. Locations, the purpose of physical location analysis is to investigate the ways in which individuals use their bodies in a naturally occurring social space. Behaviors, including language, effective use of language behavior, and analyzing how relationships between people are structured and maintained. Kind of interesting. Sometimes I will date myself by using the term groovy. The groovy was a term that people used back in the late 60s, early 70s. So I just I have fun with it. I know it's an old term that nobody really cares about anymore, but I just use it just for fun. There for a while, everybody was saying awesome. I think of any others. I'm sure there's just a ton of these things that go around. I guess if you watch Big Bang Theory, which isn't on the television anymore, Bazinga was a biggie. Just weird stuff like that. Language changes over time. Definitions change over time. Well, anyway, we won't go into all that. We could talk all day about that kind of stuff. Archival records provide opportunities for unobtrusive data collection, partially because they are quite diverse in character. Public records, actuarial records. Most societies maintain records of births, deaths, marriages, and divorces. Researchers use such actuarial records for both descriptive and explanatory purposes. Electoral and judicial records, political scientists in particular, make extensive use of legislative and other official records such as judicial decisions to study phenomena such as socioeconomic behavior and shifts in political ideology. When I was growing up, homosexuality was against the law. When I was growing up, homosexuality was a mental illness, as weird as that sounds. But in time, of course, these things changed. The laws changed up north. They were still on the books in the turn of the 21st century. And now, of course, gay marriage is legal. I mean, it was something. It wasn't even acceptable to be gay back in the 1950s and 1960s. It was like I said, it was a mental illness, and it was against the law in a lot of different states. So you could actually be put in jail for having a homosexual relationship, as weird as that sounds. But now, of course, it's not only is it legal and it's no longer a mental illness, but gay marriage is legal and acceptable, as weird as that sounds. So things have changed over time. Government documents, quasi-public documents may likewise serve as sources of data. The mass media record people's communications. These can be used to study a variety of research topics. And of course, now we have TikTok and we have Twitter and we have all kinds of interesting things that you can find out what people have said. People have lost their job recently because especially news people, because of some of the things that they said, 20 years ago, or politicians who had racist rants on Twitter or on Facebook or whatever, and it's still there. There was an individual. He was a writer for Tucker Carlson. And he had these god awful, sexist and racist rants on a select type of social media, and of course people went back and found out what he said, and they figured out who he was, and now he's lost his job as Tucker Carlson's head writer. Private records, autobiographies are the most frequently used private record. They reflect the author's sometimes official interpretation of his or her personal experiences. The diary is a more spontaneous account, as its author tends to be unconstrained by the sense of mission that often motivates the writing of autobiographies. Both autobiographies and diaries are initially directed to a single audience. It's usually the author. Letters, in contrast, have a dual audience, the writer and the recipient, from the very outset, and often reflect an interaction between them. One of the major issues researchers face in using private records is their authenticity. Two kinds of inauthentic records that have been produced by deliberate deceit, and records that have been unconsciously misrepresented. Records may be falsified or forged for various purposes, a primary one being prestige or material rewards. Ensuring authenticity first. The researcher needs to examine authorship critically. Second, establish the date of the document and verify the accuracy of the dates of the events mentioned. If the writer refers to an event whose timing cannot be corroborated by other documents, the accuracy of the original record should be taken as suspect. And of course, this is kind of a problem you're talking about select events, and if that event happened after you say that it happened, then of course it couldn't be in your letter, and that would make your letter inauthentic. Unconscious misrepresentation is much more difficult to detect. Although documents may not be false, they may misrepresent the truth for the following reasons. The authors of letters, diaries, or autobiographies may not clearly remember the facts. They may be trying to please their readers by exaggerating. They may be constrained by social norms and conventions and thus compelled to present a somewhat distorted picture. Questions to consider for authenticity. What did the author mean by a particular statement? Is its underlying meaning different from its literal meaning? A good example of that would be Shakespeare. If you read Shakespeare today, of course, Shakespeare wrote in the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century, I think. I think it was that. Maybe it was the 16th and 17th centuries. Anyway, if we read what he said, sometimes he uses a word in a select way. Well, you have to understand what that word's meaning was at that point. Rocket, for example. If Shakespeare used the term rocket, what would he be talking about? Well, certainly he's not talking about a spaceship going to Mars. He couldn't possibly be talking about that because they didn't exist at that time. So you have to understand, isn't this weird? You have to understand history in order to understand what we're talking about, as strange as that may seem. If you watch a movie from the 1940s, they'll be talking about making love. Well, what are they talking about? Are they talking about having sex, or are they talking about somebody trying to win the heart of a select individual? Well, of course, all of these things had changed over time. Hook up. The term hook up. Hook up has something to do with sex today. In the old days, hook up meant that you just got together with somebody, and now it means that you have actually performed or had sex with that select individual. Things change over time. Terms change over time, and sometimes you have to know the context of those terms in order to understand what the individual is talking about. Was the statement made in good faith? Was the author influenced by sympathy or antipathy? By vanity? By public opinion? Was the statement accurate? Was the author a poor observer because of a mental defect or abnormality? Was the author badly situated in time and place to observe the event objectively? We can talk about the assassination of President Kennedy. If you were a northerner, you felt one way. If you were a southerner, potentially you felt a completely different way about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Internet. When the internet has done quite simply is to expand accessibility to sources of information. This is just amazing. I used to, when I was working on my thesis for my bachelor or my master's degree in political science, I had to go to the library and get and find all these sources. It was the only way to do it. There were no databases back then. There were computers, but computers didn't have databases. And now, of course, from the comfort of your own home, you can look at any journal article that you want. And of course, most of them are out there for free, especially if you're an academic, or you can purchase them. In the old days, that was impossible. You had to go to the library, find the magazine, and copy it on a copying machine. That was the way it was done. My thesis was like about 3 inches thick of note cards. That's the way you do things. That's the way you did things back then. Now, of course, we've got the internet. So we have an amazingly expanded accessibility to sources of information. In many respects, computers and their peripherals have replaced much of the equipment used to do research. as I just said, once upon a time you had to go to the library. And libraries used to be packed, I mean, just constantly because everybody was doing research. Information is becoming handier. You can Google just about anything. My wife talks it to her telephone, and her telephone will give her all kinds of amazing information. Well, you know, if you have a question about anything, I mean, you can ask it any question. You know, you hear a song on the radio, and you want to know who was the first one to record that song. You know, you can find out all this information. Governments and international agencies, such as the World Bank, the United Nations, for example, are steadily making more of their official internal documents, publications, and collected data available on the internet. And of course, all this information is available to just about everybody. A census or population enumeration is a collection and recording of demographic data that describes a population in a defined territory and is carried out by a government at a specific time and at regular intervals. In theory, a census is universal and includes every person living in a designated area. The short form is a complete count census designed to reach all U.S. households. Many census data products are available on the Census Bureau's website, including those of the 2010 decennial census. And of course, this is the year of the census. My wife has been hired as a census taker, and she will, of course, most of it was already done by mail. We received a letter and we filled it out and we sent it back to them. If they don't receive information, then they have to send somebody out to see if they can secure that information. Census is very important because it has to do with representation. How many people, how many congressmen will you have from your area? And of course, not sure how Arizona works, or New Mexico, or Utah, but it's very important that this area of Iowa needs to have its representation. We want somebody in Congress who has our same way of looking at things. And we have just lost our congressman. He retired this year, so we will be electing a new congressman. Well, the census is huge. If we've lost population in this area, we may lose our congressman. And of course, they may tie us in with a different people with a different idea. The decennial census contains two forms, a short form and a long form. The short form is a complete count census designed to reach all of U.S. households. The long form contains additional questions on other variables collected from a sample of respondents consisting of approximately 17% of all households. One of the things that happened this year, of course, Donald Trump seems to not quite understand what's going on. It's not very nice, I guess. But anyway, he was trying to cut down on the number of people that would get to vote. And the census is supposed to count everybody in the area. That means everybody who is a resident of the state, and somebody, even foreign aliens, that foreign nationals that are living are also counted. Once upon a time, when the United States first became the United States, everybody was an immigrant. Everybody was an immigrant, and American Indians weren't allowed to vote. But when it first started, everybody was an immigrant. So they not only were counting people who could vote, but people who couldn't vote. And those people were allowed to be counted for Congress. Not only that, they also counted slaves, but they didn't count them as a whole human. They counted them as 3/5 of a human. As weird as all this sounds, this all has to do with history. I'm not making any strange value judgments. It was my family were abolitionists, so we were very much not in favor of this. We wanted slavery to be abolished. But as weird as that sounds, we have to count everybody, whether they are voting people or not. And as a matter of fact, until 1920, only males got to vote. So are we only counting males? No, of course not. We're also counting females, we're counting children, and that has to do with our census. We're also counting all the people that live in your area. So if you have immigrants who are not American citizens, they get to be counted just like everybody else. If you have illegal aliens, and this is what Trump was trying to do. He was trying to put a question on the census asking you if you were an illegal alien. And of course, the Supreme Court threw it out. They said you can't do that. That will make people not fill out the census form, and then we won't know how many people are there. So a lot of strange things have been happening with not just COVID-19, but just a ton of really weird stuff has been coming out of the Trump administration. Among the most common statistical areas are metropolitan statistical areas, census designated places, and census tracts. MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas, are generally defined as one or more counties having a large population nucleus plus any surrounding communities with a high degree of interaction, for example, bedroom communities. And of course, there are none of those in the Navajo Nation. There are no MSAs on the Navajo Nation. I think the largest town is Tuba City, if I'm not mistaken, but I may be mistaken. Flagstaff would be an MSA. Phoenix certainly would be an MSA. Tucson would be an MSA. Albuquerque would be an MSA, as would Santa Fe. I'm trying to think if there is a town in southern New Mexico, probably not. Salt Lake City in Utah would be a MSA. Provo would be a MSA. CDPs refer to densely populated population centers lacking legally defined corporate limits or powers. That would be a group of small communities in an area. That would be beyond Denver. You've got between Colorado Springs and Denver, you've got, it's pretty much built up between there. Well, that would be a CDP. Census tracts are small, locally defined statistical areas located within metropolitan areas and some counties. And of course, that would be Ganado, Chinle, Saley, Lukachukai, Pinyon. There you go. All those. Navajo. Modern censuses do contain errors that users of population enumeration should be aware of. Errors in coverage refers to the fact that a person or a group is either not counted or is counted twice. Errors in content occurs when information is incorrectly reported or tabulated. Apart from those errors due to carelessness, errors in content typically occur because persons surveyed may deliberately give inaccurate responses to questions measuring certain variables, such as income. Some people don't fill out the census because they think that that the government's trying to track them, and they're looking for taxes that they didn't declare last year or whatever. There's a lot of conspiracists out there. There's a lot of paranoia out there, especially since Trump has become president. He likes his conspiracy theories. So it's getting interesting out there. Content analysis provides social scientists with a systematic methodology for analyzing the data obtained from many of the types of secondary data sources. Content analysis is the study of recorded human communication. Researchers attempt to guarantee objectivity by carrying out their analyses according to explicit rules that enable different investigators to obtain the same results from the same messages or documents, that is, under conditions that permit replication. When conducting systematic content analysis, the inclusion or exclusion of content is done according to consistently applied criteria of selection. This requirement eliminates analyses in which only materials supporting the investigator's hypothesis are examined. And of course, that has been done in the past, and is unfortunately has led to some poor statistics. Content analysis can also be used to explore other elements of communication. A researcher may analyze messages to test hypotheses about characteristics of the text. Content analysis is most frequently used in describing the characteristics of messages. What inspired the message occurs when the text is analyzed in order to make inferences about the sender of the message and about its causes or antecedents. Researchers make inferences about the effects of messages on recipients. The researcher determines the effects of, say, A's message on B by analyzing the content of B's responses. Content analysis involves the interaction of two processes: specification of the characteristics of the content measured, application of rules for identifying and recording the characteristics appearing in the texts analyzed. Recording unit, the smallest body of content or text in which the reference appears and is noted. A reference is a single occurrence of the content element. And context unit, the largest body of context or text that must be examined when characterizing a recording unit. So a recording unit would be if we were looking for the word slavery and we were looking in government documents. That would be every time we saw the word slavery, that would be a recording unit. But if we were looking at a bill from 1840, that would be our context unit. How many times does it say slavery? Is slavery annotated in this document? And that would be our context unit. So the bill would be the context unit, and every time it says slavery, that would be the recording unit. 5 major recording units have been used in content analysis or search. Words or terms. The word is the smallest unit generally applied in research. When the recording unit is a word, the analysis yields a list reporting the frequencies that these words or terms appear. Themes. The theme is a useful recording unit, particularly in the study of propaganda, attitudes, images, and values. Characters. The researcher counts the number of persons appearing in the text rather than the number of words or themes. Paragraphs. Because of its complexity, the paragraph is used infrequently as a recording unit, mainly because people don't know when to start and when to stop a paragraph. So in the old days, of course, they used to have these, oh my goodness gracious, you'd be reading a book and there would be, a paragraph would take up 3 or 4 pages. And of course, as a writer and as an academic, I could have stopped that paragraph, 4 or 5 times on one page. But that's literature for you. Items. The item in the whole unit the producer of a message employs. Analytic categories must be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. Exhaustiveness ensures that every recording unit relevant to the study can be classified. Mutual exclusivity guarantees that no recording unit will be included in more than one category within the system. 4 systems of enumeration. A time-space system based on measures of space, for example, column inches or units of time, minutes devoted to a news item on the radio, to describe the relative emphasis of different categories in the analyzed material. It's kind of interesting. I look at CNN like 5 or 6 times a day just to see if something strange has happened or is happening, and you can tell how important a story is by how many times that story is on CNN, and you can also tell how important it is by how many seconds the story takes. If it takes more than the short stories will take about a minute, maybe a minute and a half. Anything over 2 minutes, and it means that they're really doing some really in-depth analysis of whatever the story is. And of course, there's tons of different stories out there. COVID-19 is a big one right now, and how we're having a summer surge. That's always important. Whether the president is talking about it, whether he's trying to convince us that everything's going to get better, or whether he's telling us that things are in bad shape. There are some scientists that are thinking that we need to go back into lockdown because the summer surge is very deadly. It's quite deadly. So we'll see what happens, I guess. I say that constantly, and I've been saying that a lot this summer. An appearance system in which coders search the material for appearance of certain attributes. The size of the context unit determines the frequency with which repeated recording units occurring in close proximity to each other are counted separately. 4 systems of enumeration. A frequency system in which every occurrence of the given attribute is recorded, like speeding. An intensity system generally employed in studies dealing with attitudes and values, but in this case it could have to do with how fast were people going. Of course, he's not stopping anybody. This is not actually in the United States. This is in England, I think. Yeah, they're driving on the left side of the road. Themes and frames. Final step in content analysis involves identifying and delineating key themes in the data. Key themes helps us understand how a phenomenon under study was framed in a historical moment and by individuals or groups. These frames then provide a link back to our starting concepts and theories, which allow one to consider whether our concepts and theories are sufficient or not for understanding the phenomenon in question. And that is the end of Chapter 13. One of the things that I need to tell you is that I will tell you that I'm going to be only teaching online. I'm going to be staying in Iowa. So if you need to talk to me, you're either going to have to write me an email or wait for one of my... if you're taking classes from me next semester, I will only be in Iowa. We're not sure what's going to happen. Our dean of psychology and business and social sciences is saying that he doesn't want to do anything but teach online until we have 4 weeks of no positives. So it looks like we're probably going to be in this mode for maybe an extended period of time. We just don't know. Okay, Chapter 14 deals with data preparation and analysis. Chapter 15 is statistics, so that should be interesting, since I've been doing statistics all summer. Okay. Yeah, coding schemes. Coding schemes have to do with when you're doing research and you're watching people, you need to figure out, you need to be able to code their behavior. So if you're talking about angry or gritted teeth, all of these would be codes that you would use. So every time somebody got angry, that you could detect, of course, or they gritted their teeth, or they clenched their fists, or they raised their voice. All of these are coding schemes. They're coding techniques. The number assigned to an observation is called a code. This code should be consistent across cases or units of analysis when the same condition exists. Information on what a code means should be listed in a code book that accompanies the data set. If a code of 1 means female, the variable associated with gender should be coded as 1 for each female. Researchers, of course, now that we're accepting other definitions of male and female, of gender, this may change. Right now, the government, if they ask you if you're a male or a female, it means are you a biological male or female. The state can name you something else. If you are a female and you decide that you want to be a male, the state can declare you a male, despite how you were born or whatever your biological structure is. As interesting as all this is, but of course, right now this is an older book. None of this has hit the textbooks yet. So, Facebook has 56 different gender identifications, and that may be the wave of the future. I see that as the wave of the future. We rarely go backwards. We rarely go back to the way it was. We always are moving in a different direction. When I was growing up, if you had long hair, you were a girl, and of course, all four of these individuals have long hair. If you had long hair, you couldn't possibly be a boy because all boys had short hair. All these strange things. Even today, if you go to a restroom, if you're going to the restroom, and you are looking for symbols, it doesn't say men or female, male or female. It may have a picture. It may have a silhouette of a male or a female. The female is always wearing a dress. Well, in two of these individuals are wearing pants. Does that mean they have to go into the men's restroom if they go to the bathroom? Well, anyway, you understand what I'm saying. Things are always changing, is what I'm trying to say, and they're always moving in a select direction, and they hardly ever go backwards. Researchers use codes to group various classifications of a concept. The following are examples of occupations that can be coded: lawyer, hairdresser, carpenter, broker, salesperson, veterinarian, ER nurse, migrant farm laborer, executive, engineer, electrician, advertising agent. All of these can be coded. The researcher needs to organize the occupations into categories. For example, professional and managerial would be lawyer, veterinarian, executive engineer. Technical and sales, advertising agent, broker, salesperson. Service and skilled labor, hairdresser, ER nurse, electrician, carpenter. Unskilled labor, migrant farm worker. When I was systems of categories such as this are referred to as coding schemes. When I was working in the hospital, I was a laboratory technician. Laboratory technicians, and you can see it any way you want, but laboratory technicians and X-ray techs and respiratory therapists, all of these people, it took them years to become what they are, and they're highly skilled individuals. But when they were categorizing us, when we were in the hospital, doctors, of course, have their category, nurses had their category, and everybody else were what they referred to as ancillary services. In other words, they supported the nurses, they supported the doctors, which was a little insulting, kind of insulting, I guess, and kind of embarrassing. But we were a bit peeved that despite the fact that we had as much education as we did, we were still considered secondary, ancillary services. The initial rule of coding is that the numbers assigned must make intuitive sense. In order to maintain the reliability of your coding, you would probably want to confine coding numbers to those starting with 0 or 1 and increasing by 1 over each category. Sequentially numbering the categories starting at 0 or 1 helps to minimize the risk of miscoding. Deductive coding allows researchers to use theory to construct response categories before they administer the instrument to respondents. I just took a drink. Researchers using deductive coding often pretest the instrument on a small sample of the population of interest, so they can modify the categories suggested by theory to fit the specific population. A researcher's intuition is one of several factors involved in coding decisions. Theory, mutual exclusivity, exhaustiveness, and detail must also be considered. The actual categories the researcher develops must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. That is, response should clearly fall into only one category, mutually exclusive, and every response must fall into a category, exhaustive. Researchers must also ensure that the categories they choose are not so broad that important differences are obscured. Detail. As I was saying, and of course this was a long time ago when I was still working in medicine, but they used to categorize people as medical professionals, and they didn't count nurses as medical professionals. They counted nurses as nurses. Medical professionals were all doctors or PAs or nurse practitioners. And of course, nurse practitioners, there was always a question: is she a nurse, or is she a nurse? Is she a nurse, or is she a nurse practitioner, an NP? And the answer was they decided that she was I guess it had to do with money. Anyway, the rest of us were just all lumped together as ancillary services, as weird as that may seem, even though it kind of included radiologists in that, but they were doctors, so they, of course, they couldn't. You wouldn't want one of those guys treating you for cancer. But anyway, I digress. Consider the following categories designed to determine the living arrangements of students. Do they live in a dormitory? Do they live with their parents? Do they live off campus? Do they live with spouse? These categories are not mutually exclusive because students who live with their parents most likely also live off campus, and students who live with a spouse might live either in a dormitory or off campus. Respondents could not be sure which category they should mark, and the people with the same living arrangement might choose different categories. And this is kind of an interesting situation. I went to a college that had a large number of fraternities. So you were either an independent or you lived in a fraternity. But then there were individuals that lived in dormitories on the campus, and then there were individuals that lived off campus. There were also individuals who were married and were living with their spouses off campus. So as you can see, that's you really need to be very specific as to what you're talking about. If we are interested in learning whether students in supervised, semi-supervised, and unsupervised living arrangements differ in academic performance, we might use these categories: live with their parents, supervised; live in a dormitory, semi-supervised; live off campus either alone with friends or with spouse, unsupervised. Exhaustiveness dictates that the enumeration of the categories is sufficient to exhaust all the relevant categories expected of respondents. Each and every response or behavior can be classified without a substantial number being classified as other. And that is a problem if you put people in categories of other. Sometimes when you start out your research, you think you've got everything covered. All of a sudden you run into somebody that doesn't fit any of the categories, so you have to create other. And then all of a sudden you have an individual that doesn't fit any of the categories, but they're not like the other person that you put in other. So now you've got two people in other, and they don't have anything to do with each other. So they need to be exhaustive. You need to create categories for everyone. Coding scheme guidelines: when in doubt, add another category, and that's what I was just saying. The theory and your knowledge of the subject matter and sample should all guide the level of detail of the categories. Inductive coding: the researchers designs the coding scheme on the basis of a representative sample of responses to questions, data from documents, or data collected through participant observations. That's inductive coding. Once the researcher has identified a coding scheme, it is applied to the remainder of the data set. The responses mentioned most frequently are included in the coding scheme used to analyze the data. In general, if a man physically abuses his wife or live-in partner, what do you think the woman should do? One, she should stay and try to work out the problem. Number two, she should leave the house or apartment. Number three, she should call a social service agency for advice. Number four, she should call the police. Number 5, she should obtain a temporary restraining order against the abuser. Number 6, she should call a friend or relative for help. Number 7, other. Number 8, don't know, refuse to answer. And number 9, missing. This is inductive coding. In an inductive coding scheme, the responses mentioned most frequently are included in the coding scheme used to analyze the data. In the preceding example, values 1 through 6 were mentioned frequently enough to merit their own categories. Values 7 through 9 were added once the inductive approach generated the first categories. In the final coding scheme, the researcher will use the other category for less frequently mentioned responses. Categories are not always easily identified, and a comprehensive coding scheme can take a long time to construct. The researcher's time is spent switching back and forth between the raw data and the evolving scheme until the categories are applicable to and tied in with the general purpose of the study. Advantages of inductive approach, flexibility and richness. It enables the researcher to generate explanations from the findings and apply a variety of coding schemes to the same observation, and often suggests new categories as well. Shortcoming of inductive approach. Researchers may be bogged down by the mass of details as they try to explain the data. Sometimes too little context is preserved for the coder to determine which details are trivial and can therefore be eliminated. Coding schemes, code numbers should make intuitive sense for the variables that can be rank ordered. For example, higher scores should be assigned higher code numbers. In deductive coding, categories should be linked to the theory from which the research hypothesis was derived. Deductive coding is most common with quantitative research. Qualitative researchers usually design the coding scheme inductively from the data in their effort to develop grounded theory. The coding categories must be mutually exclusive. Each unit of analysis should fit into one and only one category. The coding scheme must be exhaustive. Every response must fit into a category, with few responses being classified as other. Categories must be specific enough to capture differences using the smallest possible number of categories, the criterion of detail. Codebooks contain information regarding each variable's name or number, coding scheme, codes for missing data. The codebook serves as a guide for the coders who will translate the raw data onto an input device for later use in computerized statistical analysis. It is also a reference for the principal researcher and any other researchers who wish to use the data set. For research involving the use of surveys, the actual survey question is often included in the codebook. And that is what a codebook looks like. All things being equal, studies with a well-constructed codebook, pre-coded and closed-ended questions, and proper coder training are typically more reliable than studies lacking in one of these criteria, because coders do not have to exercise their own judgment in deciding what code to give a response. Intercoder reliability. One of the biggest problems in studies is making sure that the coders place the code in the correct column. It is standard practice to recheck or verify a sample of each coder's work to ensure that he or she has not been lax. Coders are required to exercise more judgment in classifying responses when they are coding open-ended questions or other non-structured material. When the rules for classifying responses do not clearly apply to a specific response, different coders may classify the same response differently. To increase coding reliability, researchers need to keep the schemes as simple as possible and train coders thoroughly. Coders can use spreadsheets to organize cases in the rows and the values of the variables across the columns. Most statistical programs require that data be arranged in this manner, and data entry personnel can quickly key in each line from the spreadsheet. However, the use of any kind of transfer sheet requires multiple handling of the data, which increases the possibility of miscodings and threatens reliability. Coders can use spreadsheets forms to organize cases in the rows and values of the variables across the columns. Most statistical programs require that data be arranged in this manner, and data entry personnel can quickly key in or import each line from the spreadsheet. Edge coding is used to eliminate the need for transfer sheets. Coders transfer questionnaire information directly onto spaces at the outside edge of the instrument. When the instrument has been edge coded, a data entry worker can key the information from the edge directly to the data storage device. Reliability is enhanced because the coder's eyes do not have to leave the instrument and do not have to keep close track of column positions. Two forms of direct data coding: coding from a questionnaire. Material coded from questionnaires must be edited to ensure that missing responses have a designated code for the input. The coder then keys in the response. When a case is completed, the program adds the information directly into the raw data file. Again, this method reduces the number of data handlers, which enhances reliability. Coding by telephone interview, computer-assisted telephone interview, and computer-assisted personal interviewing greatly reduces miscoding. Computer-assisted telephone interviewing and computer-assisted personal interviewing greatly reduce miscoding. The telephone interviews, interviewers read questionnaire items directly to respondents and input responses as they are given. If the coder keys in an inappropriate code, a value that is not designated for the particular variable, the coder is prompted to give a real value. It automatically skips questions or jumps to others as a result of filter questions. Its efficiency has reduced mail surveys. Editing and cleaning the data are important steps in data processing that should always precede analysis of the collected information. Data editing occurs both during and after the coding phase. Data cleaning is the proofreading of the data to catch and correct errors and inconsistent codes. Software programs perform most of the data cleaning for large-scale efforts, testing for logical consistency on the coding specification. Though many questions are answered and coded independently, others are interconnected and must be internally consistent. Data preparation and analysis is almost exclusively handled by computers using statistical software and other workflows programs. In psychology, we use the SPSS more frequently than anything else. But in addition to the SPSS, there are a number of other statistical software programs that compete in the same market. And of course, this is a question. This is the first point. We just hired a new psych instructor, and she's going to actually be teaching this class in the future. I'm sure she'll do a much better job than I did. But first thing she asked was, "Do you have SPSS?" And of course, I don't know because the two people that were teaching it before both left at the same time, and neither one of them were communicating very much after they left. They were kind of, I don't know why they left, but let's pretend. Well, anyway, they wouldn't give us that information, so I don't know if we have SPSS or not. I also didn't know the combination to the computers. Of course, all those computers are now gone. We had I thought we started out with like 21 of them, but when they broke into the we had a cart with the computers on it. When we broke into that cart, there were only 9 left. I don't know where the others went. It's really kind of hard to say. SAS and STATA, these programs are highly flexible so as to import data from the export data to other mediums. For example, Microsoft Excel text and ASCII files and so on. You don't need SPSS. You can also use Microsoft Excel. It will do all your computation for you. I don't know how to do it, but I was told when I was working on my PhD that I didn't need SPSS. As it turned out, I went ahead and got it anyway because I couldn't figure any of this stuff out. But they said I could use Microsoft Excel. Works just as well, they said, but I couldn't figure out how to work it. Of course, these are all gamers that gave us that information, and I'm not that I'm not that computer literate, I guess. Not as literate as a gamer. Store the data in a comparable way, while the SAS and STATA store the data in a comparable way while allowing researchers to label variables and define codes for each variable. SAS and STATA have the capacity to pull codes from other documents that are applied to the variables in the data file. Each of these programs can generate reports that effectively produce a list of variable names and their associated codes. There have been a number of developments in the area of free statistical analysis software. Our project for statistical consulting. Our project is available for free download and use. It contains extensive documentation on getting started, user-written modules and programs for more targeted types of statistical analysis, and an extensive online wiki to discuss any problems. Our project for statistical consulting also has a number of benefits that SPSS, SAS, and STATA do not, most notably its graphics capabilities. And that is the end of chapter 14. Now for the last chapter in the book. It's deals with statistics, univariate distribution. Since at least the 1950s, all social science disciplines have experienced a rapid increase in the use of statistics, and they have become essential to the field. Without statistics, we could not see the patterns and regularities in the phenomenon that we study. We need statistical methods to organize data, to display information in a meaningful manner, and to describe and interpret the observations in terms that will help us evaluate our hypotheses. Two major methods: descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. Really kind of interesting if you look at data from the 1920s or the 1930s or the 1940s. A lot of times their statistics are fairly elementary. There's not a whole lot of good data in there. And the reason is because statistics weren't being used for social sciences. It was a new phenomenon. So this is something brand new. And since social scientists started using statistics, then people have started listening to them more. Or believing them more, I guess. Descriptive statistics enables researchers to summarize and organize data in an effective and meaningful way. Descriptive statistics provide tools for describing collections of statistical observations and reducing information to an understandable form. As a matter of fact, so when we first started, when COVID-19 first started, they kept talking about lowering the curve, lowering the curve. Well, what they were talking about was this bell curve that we're talking about right here. What we wanted to do was, we knew that we were going to have a peak, and what we wanted to do was level it off so that it wasn't nearly as high. If this were deaths due to COVID-19, of course, this is the way you want to see it. You want what you want to see, and you're going to see it anyway because people haven't had the disease. So what you're going to do is see a peak, and then hopefully you'll see a downturn. Well, that's what we thought we saw in April and May. We thought we had peaked in April and May, and now we're having another peak. So what happened was we didn't level off the curve. In other words, the curve just kept going up. and I think we've had the four highest days in the last week, the four highest number of positive cases, and we're back up to 1,000 deaths a day. So of course, when we look at the COVID-19, it does not look like a bell curve. It does not shape. It's not shaped like a bell. We're still heading up. So hopefully, if it ever does look like a bell curve, I don't know where the peak is going to be, and it's going to be a slow descent back to normalcy. And of course, that's what they're saying right now, that we will not know the same normal that we have known in the past after COVID-19. Inferential statistics allow researchers to make decisions or inferences by interpreting data patterns. Inferential statistics are used to determine whether an expected pattern designated by the theory and hypotheses is actually found in observations. Both descriptive and inferential statistics help social scientists develop explanations for complex social phenomena that deal with relationships between variables. Oh. Hey, Chris. Yeah. Not a whole lot.